to this first episode of PCOS Science Live, which is an exciting initiative of the PCOS Society of India. These 12 episodes, which we are planning, one every month, is an attempt on our behalf to bring to you one of the most brilliant minds in the country so that you could look at what has been achieved, what you can achieve, get inspired by them, learn their difficulties, learn how to do research, learn how to be great clinicians, learn how to be great academicians. This is one thing which will definitely help you to understand what the brilliant minds have gone through, years and years and years of hard work, nothing achieved just with a drop of a hat. We all need to understand that they have achieved a lot, and we will want to know how they did it. So I'm most delighted to welcome today Dr. Praveen Matre, who's a emeritus professor from the KEM Hospital, and he has been pioneering a lot of work right since 20, 25 years. It's going to be a brilliant opportunity to learn from him what he has done over the years and how he has reached where he has reached. I've had the opportunity to, know Praveen right since my residency days at the Wadia Hospital. And if you go through his biodata, I don't think we'll be able to finish the session all day today. So, in short, I would like to say that I want to introduce him just with 5 lines. And then as we go along, we'll learn more about him. I would like to say he is an avid researcher, a teacher par excellence, a mentor to thousands of students, a social activist benefiting large numbers, and a perfect family man. So, welcome, Praveen. It's wonderful to have you here and to speak to you on what has happened down your road to in all the years, right from the time of your medical days, student college days, to what you are today. So, welcome to, and we, on behalf of the delegates, I wish you welcome, and we hope that we can achieve to understand all what we want to know from you. So, first question I would like to ask you is, Praveen, let me take you down memory lane today and understand from you when you decided to become a doctor, and was that your first choice? So, Praveen.
Yeah, very good morning, Duru and the audience. First of all, let me thank you for giving this opportunity to be your first speaker. I mean, it's great to have you and this platform. Putting me down the memory lane, yes, I was always an good academic student, and it continued throughout my school days. But more important than that, I was always very much keen on knowing things. How do they work, and what happens to them? How human body works. That was my interest right from the beginning, and therefore becoming a doctor was definitely my first choice. But becoming a gynecologist was an accidental thing. I was extremely interested in neurophysiology and neural science, and I had decided to pursue that branch in medicine. However, accidents do happen for good. I hope so. And I did turn myself into gynecology. I will come to that little story maybe a little later on. But
Yeah.
during my school days, I was interested in uh, reading a lot, getting the knowledge from every aspects of life. I was interested in acting, and I used to do dramas, even professional dramas, and I received first prize in professional dramas, elocution competition, painting and singing. Now all of this is now bygone, except my painting, which I still continue. So till I came to medicine, I was, I mean, not completely devoted to my education, but medicine did change me completely, and all my focus went to medical education, and that's how I became a doctor. But yes, it was my first choice.
Is that painting behind you done by you?
No, it's not done by me, but yes, there are a lot more. And I do a lot of oil paintings, but that's the biggest let out for me. Whenever stressed, it really gives a pleasure out of creation apart from medicine.
That was one
Okay.
of my hobbies too. It's strange, but even I loved painting and I did a lot of painting.
Yeah.
But coming back to you, Praveen, I know that you have excelled in everything. So you got awards in drama, you did professional drama, etc. You did win a lot of medals in your postgraduate and undergraduate days.
Yeah.
And you also have the honor of being the only person who has got some distinction in Mumbai University over the last 70 years. I mean, I want to know about that distinction of yours.
Uh, well, that's one of the story where I did start my ovarian transplant research too. I'll just share that my examination. During my MD examination, I was given a case of Turner syndrome as a long case, and I came to a diagnosis of mosaic Turner syndrome. So the examiners were very unhappy about my diagnosis. They said, "How can you come to a diagnosis of mosaic Turner syndrome?" So I narrated all the steps, and then they couldn't question me. But they said, "This is the case which has probably come from KEM hospital. You have already seen it, and that's why you can be so good at it." So they told me that you have seen this case. And I said, "No, I've never seen this case." And the challenge went on, finally, to the point that the examiners told me that we will re examine you at the end of the MD exam, and we will decide whether you really know your knowledge. So that was the biggest challenge thrown at me, and I accepted it. I said, "All right, I will come back on the last day and you can examine me." So there were 8 examiners who had brought their own cases from their institute, and all 8 examiners sitting on one side of the table and poor me on the other side. 4 hours transpired between this battle, but they were gracious enough at the end of it say that we are exhausted, and boy, you know your study well, and they granted me everything possible in that examination. They created a special degree certificate, a G4 plus as an record which was not to be broken by others. They said, "We have to give you something which classifies you." They had put all my theory papers on display board, and they gave me distinction and a Prince of Wales gold medal, which is a common medal for everyone. So that was the story, which ended on a happy note for me, and I did could get those credits, and thanks to them. And just a little story that at the end of the examination, they told me that one of my answers was that for Turner syndrome treatment, I will do ovarian transplant. So they told me, "You are living in a fool's paradise. There is nothing like ovarian transplant." And just to complete the story, 20 years after that, when the news first broke, one of the examiners, Dr. Fonseca from Sion Hospital and Dr. Thakur from Nair Hospital, called me to say that, "Boy, we were living in a fool's paradise, not you." So that was the end story of the ovarian transplant, which did make me pursue my research in a better way.
But who inspired you for research? You were a clinician. You were,
Uh, yes.
I presume.
Again, the story goes back in 1972 when Dr. Christian Bernard had come to GS Medical College. I think you may also remember that lecture. And he was in MLT to deliver the heart transplant lecture. The whole theater was jam packed, 500 all odd students and professors were there. And when he began his lecture, somehow the slide projector wouldn't work. One after another, there were 7 slide projectors brought, but nothing was working. So he was so disgusted that he just stood up and said that what India needs is not an heart transplant, but a working slide projector. I think as a student, it was a very, very disturbing statement for me. And in that foolish young time, I decided, yes, I will also do something in the transplant. Obviously, not ovarian transplant, but I would do something world's first transplant research. And that is how the idea germinated in me and made me go through that. But the MD examination and the answer was the catalyst. And that is how I started working. Immediately after my postgraduate examination, uh, the research was started at that time and finally culminated 20 years down the line.
So when did you start your practice?
Immediately after I started my postgraduate MD, I worked as an assistant professor for KEM. And 3 years then I joined Wadia Hospital as your colleague, as assistant honorary. And that is the time when I started my practice. At the same time, the research was on.
Okay. So there's been quite a bit of work you have done right since your postgraduate days, and a lot of inspiration to all our youngsters who are working in institutions where they could get inspired by you. So 29th March 2002 was a very, very important day in your life.
Yes.
What happened on that day?
Uh, Well, on 29th March was the day when I did the first ovarian transplant. Uh, it was a very mixed emotional day, a lot of burden on me. I will not go into the details, but apart from medical burden, there were a lot of other legal and government pressures on me, which I may share with you a little later on. But that was the day which was extremely important to me because it had to succeed. It had to come to a fruition. Otherwise, everything would go down the drain. So, all my life, including my medical license, were at stake. And that was the most difficult time I faced in my life because just a day prior, on 28th March evening, I received a phone call from government official saying that please cancel the surgery because if you fail, we are going to cancel your license and take away your degrees. That was the biggest blow to me on 28th March evening, and I was crying a lot. That was the time it was a great decision to make whether I go ahead or I do not go ahead. But I'm very happy to say that Dr. Jyoti, who's my wife and a co-researcher at that time, stood behind me and said that Praveen is your dream, go ahead. If they want to cancel, if that is what is going to happen, let it happen. But I don't want to give up your dream. And therefore, with that heavy heart and a lot of burden, we did our first transplant. And with grace of God, we did succeed in that transplant. So it was a big achievement for me and a big achievement for proudly to say to be an Indian to achieve that. So
Absolutely.
29th March was a big, big, big day. It's itch in my life and has real lasted with those memories forever.
And I'm so happy that it was Jyoti who gave you that strong support, which normally partners do for each other. When we are in some kind of a dilemma, it's they whom we look up to.
That's
And I
right.
know Jyoti so well. She was my resident and she was my houseman because I was a registrar, a brilliant mind herself. Very, very sort of, determined to do what she was doing and very, very particular about what she did. So it's hats off to her also to be your
Thank
great
you.
on
I
this
will
day.
convey this to
That is
Jyoti
why I
later.
said you're a family man. That's what I said.
Yeah.
Tell me one more thing. How soon after you announced your ovarian transplant in the news
Yeah.
did BBC get in touch with you?
That's again something very nice to share with you because on 7th of May, government decided after they went through all my paperworks and everything, and they found that yes, it is a successful transplant where we showed that she has started menstruating, she has started ovulating, and all the hormonal records and were scrutinized, and they decided yes on a with a government press conference they will declare this. So on 7th of March 2002 the government took the press conference and declared this. The whole thing was in the afternoon, and by evening it was over. So by about 5 o'clock, I came home and I was okay, very happy about the whole thing to happen. At 7 o'clock in the evening, I receive a phone call saying that I'm speaking from BBC and we would like to interview. So I was taken aback. I said, none of the Indian press has contacted me. Nothing is happening on this ground. So someone is trying to pull my legs. So I thought some of my friends must be doing that. So I was very casual about it. I said, okay, it's all right. So they said, we'll call you at, late in the evening and please be ready because the whole night the session will go on. So I said, all right. I mean, I also played along with them thinking that it's a fun going on. But to my greatest surprise, at 11 o'clock at night, I first get BBC London call and they took my live interview on BBC. BBC London, then it was followed by BBC Asia, Hindi and Urdu, and the whole thing went on for whole night. But the part which I liked the most was obviously I must appreciate and pledge my thanks to BBC being the first news rather channel to come to me. But the opening statement they made on the BBC London was the greatest thing which made me very happy. They said till now the latest research is always been flowing from west to east, and this is the first incidence documented that the research is flowing from east to west. And here we present the ovarian transplant. I think those remarks were something which were extremely pleasing to me as a personal and as an Indian and an Easterner to be very happy about. Yeah.
Now you know why you're my first person on the episode of Peaceful Science Live, because I'm
Oh,
so proud that it's an Indian who has brought in something which is going to benefit millions all over the world. And this is why you're here, Praveen, all for your achievements. So, in short, I wanted to come to the next question to you is that this research which you did, how many years did it take you to reach where you are?
uh,
And how many years did it take you to do that first ovarian transplant? What all did you go through?
yes, I think before I joined this, uh, can I be putting a little word for my mentors who
Yes,
were there for me?
sure.
Uh, the first of all, when I was undergraduate student, uh, I had a privilege to learn under Dr. Daftari, and during after finishing MBBS, somehow uh, I thought that I would work with Dr. Daftari because uh, I started liking gynecology, and that was the first thing from neurology which made me change my idea to gynecology. And when I worked with Dr. Daftari, I started my research at that time. I mean, we were the first one to do the partogram and creating a nomogram for Indian primigravids and multigravid. And we did present that research at All India Conference, and I got the first prize as an intern at that time. Uh, did a lot of research at the same time with use of acrylflavin as an abortifacient, and I conducted a lot of animal experiments in ICMR. So that was the time I got introduced to ICMR. So my first mentor, I would thank Dr. Daftari, who has been very, very instrumental in changing my line in medicine as well as introducing me to research. My second greatest mentor when I started working with at KEM with Dr. V.N. Purandare. Uh, the man who taught me boldness in surgery, the man who taught me to think out of the box. He will always ask me the question that how different you can approach this problem. So always inculcating that idea in the mind that there is a standard procedure, but can you improve it? Can you change it? Can you do something new? That was the greatest thing which happened in my life. So these are the two great mentors who really shaped my ideas in research and doing something out of the box. And the third thing, which is a institute, which played a greatest thing in my research, was my introduction to ICMR. So when I did my uh, internship research project on animal experiments, that is the time I got hooked on ICMR. ICMR literally became my second home. I think I have to thank enough for their library, which I am still using even today. And obviously, my current research, a lot more things are connected with ICMR. So these are the three very, very important things happened in my life, which changed my outlook and made me, what I am today. So I must say thank you to all these two great teachers. Dr. V.N. Purandare is no more, and ICMR as an institute. Coming to your question about how did I and how many years it took me to the ovarian transplant. Well, it was a story which is almost encompassing 20 years of my life. When I first started reading about a transplant. There was not much available on transplant. So I first started getting the anatomy correct. So I did cadaveric dissections at KEM hospital for 6 months at length. And I studied the pelvic vascular architecture, because something very different is that ovarian artery is very small and it doesn't have a matching vessel into the pelvis. So to identify that, I did cadaveric dissection. And what I learned the anatomy at this cadaveric dissection, believe me, it is not there in any of the books. So ovarian artery anatomy is entirely different than what we learn. I will not go in the details of that, but that is first thing what I did. Secondly, I started doing animal experiments. And these animal experiments I did with ICMR, where we started doing rat ovaries, and we started doing grafting the rat ovaries, transplanting them, and trying to see the results, what happens to them. And we started putting them back under the skin, and etc. All different experiments we conducted there. The third thing I wanted to do was to learn how we can transfer. So I started going to the dog laboratory, dog centers of BMC or Mumbai Corporation, and when they used to castrate these dogs as a family planning measures. So I requested them that give me these castrated organs and I will retransplant them for 10 minutes. And they used to that a lot at dog centers in Thane. And of course, thanks to Johnson and Johnson, where I also did my animal experiment. So the second part was doing the animal experiments and getting proficient with these things. The next thing was being an observer. As although ovarian transplant was the first thing which has started in the history, it never took on. So the accepted transplant was renal transplant. So I decided I want to be an observer in the renal transplant. Believe me, I must have written to hundreds of institutes to allow me to be an observer. 99 turned me down. They said, a gynecologist, why should he come to the renal transplant? And again, I would like to say Dr. Bhanera from KEM, who was then at Hinduja Hospital, was very kind enough to grant me an observership at Hinduja Hospital, where I became an observer in renal transplant department, where I learned not only the surgery, the pre-op, the post-op, the scanning, the legal aspects. So a lot of information I got it from this renal observership. And at the same time, when I wrote about my animal experiments world over, Professor Peter Morris from Oxford was extremely kind enough. He was impressed and he said that you can come to Oxford to be an observer. And he called me at Oxford. And I spent my time at Oxford to learn the renal transplant. But he was so nice enough that he opened the doors for vascular department. And believe me, what I must have learned in the vascular department, all except heart transplant, practically anything and everything like aortic transfers, all the anastomosis, everything I learned there. So again, these are the two important events in my life where I learned. Now, most of the time in the renal transplant, I used to get my students who were working there. And they're always fascinated saying that, sir, what are you doing here? And I would always say that I am a student here, so don't call me sir. And like a student, I literally went on imbibing this knowledge over the years. And finally, in 1995, my first transplant was ready. Very unfortunately, that was the time the kidney racket broke, and the government did not, they said nothing doing. They wouldn't even let me enter into their department to get the permission. It took 7 years to finally get my permission in 2002. And that's where 29th March 2002 stands, where I did my first transplant.
Okay. So that's quite an amazing story, Praveen. I mean, I know you have wrapped it up in about 5 to 7 minutes, but 20 years of work you cannot put into 5 minutes. I know that you have a lot of your surgeries probably available on YouTube. If it is, then please share the link with everyone so that we could all watch it and see what exactly you have done with it. Now, I have a few questions regarding this research itself, where you have transplanted ovaries. I'm sure the reason you did that was because women are born with problems with their ovaries. They do have primary ovarian failure, they have primary ovarian insufficiency. So, in those cases, yes, I think it helped women in those days to conceive, to get their periods, etc. Now, the question is that after we have been able to retrieve eggs and have egg banking, and IVF has been really propagated very heavily. Is there any role for ovarian transplant as of today, in today's times? According to you, where do you see it going?
Yes, I think it's a very good question, and a question which is very pertaining to today's scenario. If one is taking reproduction as the only goal, then I think that cannot be answered by ovarian transplant. I don't think that's where it goes to. But this idea of doing this transplant was basically for Turner syndrome girls who are not only phenotypically bad, to give them what is called as a life with purpose, a life with essence, a life which is comparable to others. And believe me, when these girls have received this ovarian transplant and they have transferred literally into a beautiful woman, maybe for whatever time the transplant lived, 7 to 9 years was the maximum life. That was the greatest achievement according to me. Second important thing, that this opens a door for ovarian banking. That is where my the next part of the research went in. In 2005, I started ovarian banking. Now, this ovarian banking was banking for the tissue. The whole idea was basically for young girls who are undergoing cancer treatment at Tata Memorial Hospital. And these girls, I was planning to retrieve their ovaries, cryopreserve them, and give them back later on. Well, I will come to that part a little later, but it did work for a couple of years. But because of financial difficulties, which I will share with you a little later on, I could not pursue with this. But at the same time, we started our research on whole ovarian cryopreservation. And this is the greatest idea according to me, because if you can cryopreserve the entire ovary, then it has got a lot of meaning rather than cryopreserving the ovarian tissue. As very rightly you have put in, that getting the eggs and cryopreserving the primordial follicles and growing them will definitely subserve your purpose of reproduction. But my idea was to give them a lasting organ which can continue to give not only this, but their natural hormones. Now, coming to the whole ovarian cryopreservation, although I tried, and all world over, it has been tried a lot. Somehow we have not achieved the success of a whole ovarian cryopreservation. It has its own problem, but I'm sure life doesn't stop here. The research will continue. At the end of it, we will be able to get the whole ovarian cryopreservation. As something which I will like to put on here, as one of my experiences about you can give exogenous hormones to Turner syndrome. We always give them. They do change their phenotypic look. Now I will share you my experience. Now the first girl on who Turner syndrome to whom I did the ovarian transplant, before the transplant, this girl would always behave like a tomboy. She was always like a tomboy, and she would come and, with a drop of hat, she would remove her clothes, stand in naked in front of me to get examined. Right? There was nothing wrong about it. I mean, she wouldn't think at all me as a male character. Post transplant, believe me, within 3 months, this girl turned not only phenotypically changing herself, but by 6 months, there are a lot of psychological things which change. And now this girl will have to be coaxed to remove her or undress and get examined by me. She had those looks that, look here, he is a male, I don't want to do that. Now these psychological changes which came in my patients, I think they are not seen with exogenous hormones. I tried to look into this, read about this, to get over what makes them change. Well, I have not succeeded. But one thing is sure, that this psychological change and their attitude going towards a femininity is something which I only found in these transplant girls, not in with exogenous hormones. So all in all, it has its own place, may not be a big one like an IVF, which is running. It cannot be run like an factory or a big domain. It has its own small place, but definitely it has a place in the research where it can take us to a different level.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. But then probably neurophysiology could be coming into play here when you say that their entire outlook changes when you have changed ovaries. I
Yeah.
mean, it's a very good observation you have made, which I have never imagined. But now coming to think of it, whilst we are discussing this, since we are the Society for Polycystic Ovaries, do you
Yeah.
think changing those PCO ovaries and putting in normal ovaries would help in such women?
Uh, uh, Again, I think a question which rather puts me into a phase of maybe quiescence. But let me tell you one thing, that PCOS, although of course there is a lot of research and study going on, you have the society which is doing a great work over there, but it has a genetic origin. Now, wherever there are genetic origin, then changing an organ probably is not going to help. So what you have to do is probably do the genetic engineering to these girls to make their same ovaries more functional or more normal. So I don't think, sorry to say, but ovarian transplant, the transplanted ovaries will not be doing great job. Just to share a little something different, because I used to get a lot of calls from Tata Hospital where ovarian cancer girls were undergoing surgery. And one of my transplant girls, she had an primary oophorectomy on one side, second ovary then knocked off at second time. And that time, Dr. Amita had called me to say that can we salvage her ovary, and we couldn't. So finally, she had both bilateral oophorectomy done, and then she came to me for a transplant, and I did transplant on her. But there was always a scare that will she get a recurrence of cancer in this new ovary. So what I'm trying to say is the environment is, if it is not going to be changed, then changing the organ may not be the answer. The same will apply to PCOS.
No, but let me add on to that. There has been recent research with polycystic ovaries that only about 10% of it is really inherited genetically. A large percentage of PCOS is happening in utero,
Hmm.
whilst the environment around the baby is hyperandrogenic. And coming from there to your next research of what you have currently found with your MRKF syndrome,
Yeah.
where you have been working on creating a vagina for women who are born without a vagina,
Yeah.
and you have looked at how you can create a vagina from something which is totally natural. This is another first in the world which you have achieved, I presume, which I think it is so. But I'm not so well read on that subject, but let me know. And that is one. And secondly, you have also been able to, determine the genetic, the gene code for that change.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that.
Uh, sure. Now this the I started on ovarian transplant. I got it going. Then unfortunately now just a little statement before I go on to the next answering your question is all my finances are personal finances for the research. Not a bit of money has been taken from anyone. That was something which I am very proud to share with you and say about it. The reason is that when I started doing this ovarian transplant, I approached many hospitals where I can start the center. So the first question was, is it economically viable? Yeah, will it give us something in return? Apart from that, even my own institute was not very keen on doing this research. So everyone had turned me down, saying that this is something which is world's first. We do not wish to enter into this. So I had a great support from the center, which I started as an ovarian, which I did not mention in my research time. Starting a center with government recognition is very, very difficult. And I must say, Kothari Hospital was very kind enough and helped me throughout in this to start a center to get me registered as a transplant center. What I'm trying to say is that that was the thing which made me that, okay, if no one is going to finance the research, I will finance my research and I will continue. Uh, Unfortunately, Ovarian Bank, I had to stop it because of this reason. So then I changed my attention to another problem of congenital problem of absent vagina. And when I started working on this vagina, obviously, as the first thing is that I was always already doing vaginoplasties by different techniques, skin, amnion grafts, and whatnot. And a little story bifurcation is when I was using amnion graft, we were using fresh amnion graft. So always there is a cesarean which is to be planned and acquiring that. To get over this, I worked with Tata Tissue Bank and we started doing the amnion, freeze-dried amnion. And Tata Tissue Bank was very kind enough to support this, my project. And we started creating freeze-dried amnion and started using them. Believe me, we have given up obviously now with this new technique. But I'm happy to say that this freeze-dried amnion today is still used in a large way for burns dressing. So I'm happy that our research has contributed in some other way. Anyway, coming back to this absent vagina research, when I was reading the embryology, I realized that peritoneum develops from the mesothelial lining and Mullerian duct also develop from invagination of mesothelial lining. So in short, the peritoneum and the Mullerian duct has got the same parentage. So if the parentage is same, then can we make them change into something else? The peritoneal use was first described by Davidoff in 1975. So that was the first idea which he had propagated, but without realizing what it can be done. And then I took the same idea, worked on this, developed my 3 different techniques, and we started doing the use of peritoneum. And with our technique, we found that yes, it converts itself into a normal vagina. But that didn't stop me there. I mean, I was, as usual, a very, very inquisitive person, why it happens and how it happens. So I continued the research. And then I wanted to show how it changes from peritoneum to a normal vagina in a stepwise manner. So I started doing biopsies of this peritoneum at a weekly interval post-operatively. So we have shown how the peritoneum gradually changes itself into a normal vagina. The idea was something which again came that all of us very well know that peritoneum can undergo change into an endometrium in endometriosis. In ovarian tumors, it can go into an epithelium, like anything you can speak of, gastric cancer, Peritoneum is even known to change itself into cartilage and bones. And the greatest work which is available today, which is peritoneal dialysis, which today no one does it, but they have shown how the peritoneum literally changes itself into a filtering mechanism. So all these things made me push that I can change the peritoneum into vagina. So when we did this biopsy, we showed how it changes in a sequential manner, and we have documented this. The next question was, well, it does change, but who makes it change? So we wanted to identify the progenitor cells. So we continued the research in that direction, and then we started identifying the progenitor cells which are responsible for this change which happens into the vagina. And again, when we did identify the progenitor cell and showed these changes, the question did not stop there. Question is again, who guides the progenitor cells to come there? So we identified the translational markers, and then we identified the genomes, which I would like to share at the end of it to a little bit about how these changes happen and how the progenitor cell was identified, the translational markers, and the genomes. So these are the steps in my research. And a very comforting idea was, for this research, I did not require any government permission. So there were no, binding things like an ovarian transplant, which takes about a year and a half to get one case permission. It's a very difficult and tedious job. So I was out of the government bonding and could continue this research unhindered. And obviously, the end result is there today.
So you're able to create a vagina out of peritoneum,
Yes,
which you're doing laparoscopically.
that's right.
Now, when you create that vagina, does
Yeah.
it, when you do a speculum examination, normally when we used to use in the past skin grafts and then we moved over to amnion grafts,
Yeah.
does the vagina look the same as a normal vagina? Would any doctor examining such a patient would be
Yeah.
able to say that this vagina has been created out of peritoneum and not normal? Would you?
Uh, I will share these pictures to you, and
Okay.
you can be a judge, and you
Yeah.
can tell me that, does this vagina look normal? But believe me, it absolutely not only looks like vagina. We have done the anatomical confirmation on various parameters. We have done the functional confirmation on various parameters. And even I will share you the vaginoscopy pictures at the end of 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and 4 weeks, how these changes occur. And I'm sure I will leave it to you and the audience to be the judge of saying, uh, three of my patients have been from medical fraternity, two of them a gynecologist themselves. And believe me, none of these girls, when they get married, need to disclose that this vagina was not created. The vagina almost, or it is a normal vagina in all parameters. And they have no telltale sign of surgery because it is laparoscopy and perineal. So no one can say. And at the end of it, I even try to give them a hymen later on. So it looks, or it every way it is normal for them.
Even all the layers of the vagina, including the
Yes,
muscularis, etc., everything.
yes. There is
Oh,
there is only one thing which lacks here, which I will show you on the slides. What are we lacking there? It's only the elastic substratum which is little lacking as compared to normal vagina. But look-wise and function-wise, they're absolutely normal.
absolutely. Brilliant, absolutely.
Yeah.
So when you talk about, discovering the genomes and when you talk about, honestly, when I read about genes, etc., there are so many names which come up which are totally new, totally, peculiar names. And I was wondering, how do you, how are these genes named? It's just a curiosity which I have. I mean, they've got such peculiar names. I mean,
Yeah.
how do you?
Well, I obviously cannot go in all the genomes, but I can tell you one greatest example of genomes, how they are named. Now,
Yes.
one of the genome which all of us, would remember or know is called as Hoxha gene. So it
Yes.
is Hoviobox gene.
Yes.
Now, when this gene was first studied, it was studied in a small fly called Drosophila. Now, this is Drosophila, which we have learned in our biology during college days. And this has 8 chromosomes. So it is the greatest, easiest way to study. Now, when they did this study, they found that when this gene is transplanted into the head, the legs develop from the head of that fly. So this was the very funniest thing. And then they decided, yes, this is the box which can be changed and it can put it. So the name came because the Drosophila, the legs were taken from abdomen and implanted into the head. So different names come with a different technicality, and going through them is really marvelous to read about it. And believe me, as I learned about immunology and pharmacology for my ovarian transplant, I did read a lot of basics about genetics. Obviously, I can't claim to be an expert, but at least a basic knowledge, which is good enough for us to understand, was always the thing for me to be happy about. And that is how we go about.
Brilliant, absolutely. So, coming to the next question is that you have this MRKH syndrome, and I think about 30% of the patients do have a problem of hyperandrogenism.
That's right.
We also see in PCO patients.
Yeah.
Can you connect the two in any way?
Yes. When we started analyzing this MRKH syndrome, now I have almost more than 250 to 300 cases which I have been managing. And when I studied these patients, there are 3 groups of MRKH girls. The first group, which is about 20 to 30%, is pure MRKH. That means they just have absent vagina, obviously the uterus, which is small, but nothing more than that. The next group, which is about 40%, is a large group, which is associated with anomalies. So these anomalies are skeletal anomalies, the cardiac anomalies, and the renal anomalies. The renal anomalies play a big role in our management, as well as the skeletal and heart anomalies because of the anesthesia problem. But the last group, which as a PCOS society, you will be very much interested in, is in association with hyperandrogenism. Now, these are the girls who have really big ovaries, which are like a typical PCOS associated with hyperandrogenism, all hirsutism, you name all the hormones which are also in that parameters to go on. Now, when I started studying them and I started learning more about it, there is something. Of course, I have one more research which is currently going on, is on placenta, which I have not talked about it. But when I was reading about the epigenetics of placental disorders, we have identified, I'm sorry, the researchers have identified that placenta plays a great role in this hyperandrogenism. Uh, Now, none of us know that male placenta is different that of a female placenta. I mean, we think that all placenta are same. Maybe it's a male baby or a female baby. But the research, which is 2004, 11, 14, and 16, have concluded that placenta plays a great role in changing the brain of a fetus from female to male. So all conceptors are destined to be female. It is some additional efforts to make them male. So to change a male brain, it takes a placental androgen secretion. Now, if these androgen secretions are extra or there is an aberration, they can lead probably to a female with PCOS genetic origin. So these are definitely, because hyperandrogenism, very simple. If there are male hormones, they do not allow the Mullerian duct to develop. it is MIH effect which is there. So this Mullerian duct and androgen levels have got a balance, or anything which affects that balance would allow either a partial development of Mullerian duct and at the same time will lead to PCOS. So a lot of research need to go on this direction. I'm trying to do it, but I don't know when it will come to fruition.
You could guide us actually through the PCOS Society. We'll be delighted to work with you on this. And if you have any thoughts, please let us know, and we will definitely take it forward.
Yeah.
I think more or less we have had quite a bit of discussion, and I'm very anxious to see your videos and your whatever you would like to show us in the last few minutes of our presentation today. So we're happy if you can share them with us.
First, I will just share a video of ovarian transplant, which I'm sure people should be happy to see. And then, if time permits, I'll change you a little bit of how the vagina changes. So the priority is yours. You tell me what you would like to see first.
We have 10 minutes. You show us what all you can show us.
Oh, God. That's okay. I'll just show you quickly the video of okay, I'm showing you first the anatomical confirmation of, can you see this?
Yes.
Right?
I can see.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay. Now, now these are the vaginal cytology pictures. You can see these cytology pictures. This shows both the keratinized superficial cell and intermediate cells. This is cytology taken from the neovagina. I'm sure no one can say that this is not a neovagina. Now, this is the serial conversion of, now you can see the normal peritoneum, which is a very flat cuboidal epithelium, which you can see. Then you can see this day 7 picture of the neovagina or the peritoneum. The lining is still single layer, but the adventitia has become very edematous and thick. Then by second week, there is a multi-layer formation of the vagina, which you can see here, and there is a mononuclear and polymorph infiltration, and now starts vascular endothelium appearing, and this is the vasculogenesis stage of the peritoneum. By end of third week, you can see these vessels have been started forming. The vasculogenesis is trying to become complete, and now angiogenesis has started. That means the vessels are forming into microcapillaries. And by end of 28 weeks, the neovagina shows absolutely a normal multi-layered squamous epithelium and well-organized capillaries into the substratum. Now, this is what you will be happy to see. You were asking me the questions that if I put in a speculum, how does it look? Now, this is the end of the first week. It is looking thin single layer peritoneum, which is red absolutely, because substratum is nothing but full of red substratum. By the end of second week, you will see white spots which have started appearing into the vagina. Now, these are the metaplastic lesions which are converting the peritoneum into a normal vagina. By end of third week, you can see many spots which starts coalescing, and by end of 4 weeks, the entire peritoneum is now covered into the metaplastic lesion. So this is the phase of change in the first month. By end of 3 months, you can see a vagina which is normally developed. Now, at the end of 3 to 6 months, we have did this vaginal biopsies. And this vaginal biopsy shows a multiple stratified squamous epithelium with or without keratinization, which you can see at the end of 6 months. So at the end of 3 months, it's a multi-layer squamous epithelium. By end of 6 months, the keratinization also appears. The greatest thing which happens in this vagina is, now you can see the preoperative picture. This is the pre of MRKH, absent vagina, and this is the postoperative picture. I'm sure you will agree with me that this vagina or this external genitalia appears nothing but normal. Try and put in a speculum and now tell me, Duru, does it look like a vagina or does it look like something different? And to your right are the sigmoid, the scheme, and the ileal vaginoplasties. Now, the hallmark of our research is not only look like vagina, but the spontaneous or the lubrication which occurs, which is a natural lubrication. They do not require any lubricant. Sexual stimulus does produce the lubrication which is coming from here because they do have Bartholin's gland which are present there, and of course the vagina also contributes to them. The next question was identifying these peritoneal stem cells. So we tried to identify the peritoneal stem cells, and after identifying them, we tried to analyze them into this neovagina again from first, second, third, and fourth week. And we identified SOX2 and OC4 as translational markers. And these are the different parameters of which they come. Now, SOX2 and OC4 differ in their behavior completely. How and why they do so, I have no answer to them. But you can see the distribution pattern is entirely different. It may be circular, it may be tubular, it may be spot-like. Again, why and how they appear like this is an enigma which we are trying to solve, but it is not very easy to solve them yet. Uh, Now, about the functionality. So when I talked about my vaginoplasty and say how good it is, I must be able to analyze and say what it lacks in. So we did a transperitoneal 4G ultrasound in a sexually inactive normal vagina and sexually active normal vagina. So in sexually inactive normal vagina, the vagina is anteroposteriorly closed cavity and is a transverse slit. In an active sexually vagina, in a normal patient, it's a U shape or a smiling face. When we go a little beyond and we did a 4D ultrasound transperineal for our neovaginas, what we found as compared to normal vagina, this is lacking in its elastic substratum. So it's little more dilated than a normal vagina. So I was a little unhappy about it, that I said it looks like vagina, it functions like vagina, but well, it is not on all parameters because we have not been able to develop the elastic substratum. To tackle this question, I use different technique, and we use a thick peritoneal graft by using a lot of substratum, hoping that it will create a normal elastic substratum. But well, it did not function. To counter this, we have our research is now on the second phase, which is called as development of MSC or mesenchymal stem cells. And we have been able to grow them, but we want to grow them in such abundance that we should be able to transplant them. So this is still going on. We have not concluded. But most of the time, the difficult questions have got simple answers. And the simple answer came in the form of exercises. So when I started teaching these girls exercises, you can see yourself that this is a neovagina at the resting phase, a big dilated. When they did Valsalva maneuver, it beautifully contracts. And with the pelvic floor contraction, they started behaving like a normal vagina. So as a routine now, all my girls post-operatively are taught perineal exercises, and I found that it has taken at least some 60 to 70% functionality close to that of the vagina. And when we did the PROMIS score, modified PROMIS score for sexual satisfaction, it was comparable to normal vaginas. So all in all, these are some of the things which are important. Do I have some more time, or do we are getting off with the time? A little more?
You could take 5 minutes more.
Yeah. So would you like to go to the anatomical variations,
Yeah.
which and the difficult question? Yes. The most important thing are the renal anomalies which are associated with this. The skeletal and cardiac anomalies pose a great anesthetic complication, but the vascular variations are very important. Now, my aim is to, our change of technique is completely now that with the uterine arteries are at a lateral state, the superior vesical artery, the vaginal arteries, all these which I identified during the surgery and try and preserve them. I do not do a blind dissection. So just some of the very interesting cases which may be happy to share. Now, this, can you see this case? This is the pelvic kidney. This is the case of double ureter. This is the case of single pelvic kidney which is sitting on the bladder. This is a single pelvic kidney with the two ureters which are absolutely entwined with each other. And now you can see this is a double ureter. I don't want to go in detail. Now, this is a very classical case who came to be post-marriage. And she said that I want to undergo vaginoplasty. And when I examined her, I said that, oh, she has got a beautiful vagina. Then why she wants a vaginoplasty? And then the answer came very shocking. This girl at birth didn't have anus. So she underwent an anal pull through. And this was an anal pull through which was done so close to the urethra that she was having a sexual intercourse in this anus. And that is the dilated anus. And there was paper thin area between the urethra and this anus. So it was a very, very challenging case to do. The next challenging case is a 9-year-old girl who had 9 surgeries since birth, a case of Kaufman syndrome with hydrometrocolpos, and she had undergone n number of surgeries for that. We were very happy to, see the result, but you can see this MRI picture, a hydrometrocolpos, a hematosalpinx, a large endometriosis, and practically she had no space in between. She had undergone a ileal vaginoplasty at the time of one of the surgeries. And such failed case also we operated, gave her a normal vagina, and I'm happy to say at 13 years of age, 4 years down the line, she's menstruating normally and has no complications so far. This is again a case of androgen deficiency, aromatase deficiency, and this looks like an Turner syndrome, but she was the case where we operated and gave her a successful vaginoplasty. And you can see this creation of a vagina. She had clitoromegaly, we did clitoral reduction. She had bilateral cysts, which were operated, which were given treatment with exogenous estrogen, and now she's menstruating normally. So these are many cases where we try to, difficult cases rather, to operate. And now I would just share, if the time permits, to show you the ovarian transplant.
You would probably have the surgery as a complete surgery, which anyone who likes to see would be able to see as a link or something.
Yeah, I can share the link also. There is an YouTube video. I can share the link later on also.
Yes. So we'll share it
Yeah,
with viewers. You can see the entire thing. You could definitely use it here.
Yeah. Just a couple of minutes about my few researches which are ongoing. If you can permit me to speak about that. Currently, I'm working on stem cell. We are trying to develop the mesenchymal stem cells from autologous tissue, and mainly we are using Omentum. We have not been able to develop a real good quantum of that, but I'm sure some other time we will be able to do that. My next research which I'm doing is on placental extravillous cytotrophoblast and their role in differential contractility. So these two researches are ongoing, and I hope that I'm able to achieve something in this direction too. So this is something which I just thought I would share with you.
It's wonderful to know all what you have done, Praveen, and I think hats off to you with your brilliant work. And you have been honored as Emeritus Professor by the KEM Hospital and Nauroji Wadia Hospital. You truly, truly deserve it. I want you to also give a message once your session is getting over. I want you to give a message to the young minds today as to what they need to do different than what they're doing today.
Uh, well, I don't think I can give a message, but I am sure I can give a bit of advice, because teaching is always my passion and students are always my inspiration. So I can always say that students are the one who really ask me difficult questions, and that always make me think more. So my advice to everyone is that research need not be great. Research can come from some simple things also. And if you read a lot, if you contemplate, when you study, you do not study like our education system of rattling out, but try and understand. This is the simple thing which will make you happy in your life. And when you start loving your work, it no more remains a work. Uh, the last and the most important thing is that whoever you are, at whatever stature you are, try to be a student, try to learn. There is something always more in, rather saying that I know my subject, I would always like to find out what I do not know about my subject or others. So being a student is something which will always help you, and let it be the smallest possible idea you can work on. Let it be your own research, and please do not do reproduction and reduplicating the research which has been done. Try and be on your own. That's all what I would like to share. And before I say bye, I want to play my thanks to Duru for giving this opportunity, to sharing your platform, to speak about my mind and my experiences. Thank you very much.
Oh,
And
it's been an honor, Praveen. It's been an honor for you having to share so much, and I wish we could give you more time, but I could go on the whole day, I think. But we have viewers who want to listen to something else, what is going on, and I wish you all the best in your life, and wish you so much more in your research that we want you to make India even prouder. Thank you so much.